you. Welcome to the call, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're from, wherever you're at. I hope you've had a really good start of your week. I'm Michael Labate. I'm president of North America at Intellius, and I will be hosting this live event. And we're going to discuss rethinking cybersecurity in our vast and often complex digital environment. I'm joined by some fantastic industry guests who have addressed and protected against significant cybersecurity issues throughout their careers. With me is Ria Aiken. Ria is Director of Business Information and Security Operations, as well as third-party risk management at Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Ria brings actually recognized as an expert in operations and risk management strategies. Also with me is David Myman as an associate professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Georgia State University, is also a special advisor at VIDOC Group and brings perspectives from academia to our discussion. Roy Hadley is a business lawyer and trusted advisor at Adams and Reese, and he also advises businesses, governments, and organizations worldwide on topics we're going to be discussing today. And finally with me is Russell Eubanks. He is a cybersecurity expert. He's also the founder of Security Ever After. This is an organization that helps companies and institutions assess different and various vulnerabilities related with cybersecurity and protect against those live threats. So welcome to the panel, Ria, David, Roy, and Russell. So glad to have you.
Good to be here.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. So let me start by saying a couple of things we're going to do on this call. I'm going to give a little bit of context on this topic, and we've got a series of questions. We'll also save some time for Q&A. So those of you who are just joining, please use the Q&A or chat box. We'll be monitoring that. We'll follow up with questions at the end. We probably can't do an exchange live audibly with our panelists, but certainly use that chat mechanism. So what does it mean to rethink cybersecurity, right? In today's digitized world, you have new risks emerging literally every second, and cybercrime is becoming big business. And with that big business becomes this sort of big set of consequences that organizations and governments have to respond to globally. So this has become the hot topic for many data-sensitive industries like fintech, banking, even into education technology. And this threat increases and evolves over time. Think about mobile transfers, electronic payments, cryptocurrency, the emergence of cryptocurrency and trading, et cetera. These all bear significant cybersecurity pressures, and thereby we need strategies as chief information security officers, chief information officers. So our panel will discuss different strategies that they've employed, either within their organizations or for their clients, that consider how to defend against cyber threats and how to execute and measure those programs for success. And we'll also highlight the essential steps required to ensure that the overall business is aligned and the legal objectives are aligned, because without that alignment, the strategy isn't executed right. So without further ado, let's jump in. Once again, thank you to our panelists. The first question comes in. Russell, I'm going to ask you this one, and then Ria as a follow-up. So you guys, as well as everyone on the call listening, we all aware and have been following for some time this Colonial Pipeline attack, right? And we received a lot of public attention because of its impact on society, consequences on businesses, et cetera. So with regard to cybersecurity defense as a core part of the overall IT strategy, what steps do you recommend should be considered to ensure the organization is protected? Russell.
Thanks, Michael. I really enjoy this conversation. To me, this comes to several ideas. For me, the very best advice I've ever been given is this. It's called get wisdom as cheaply as you can. Get wisdom as cheaply as you can. I think there's several places where we can learn from breaches, exposure such as Colonial and others, so that we don't have to suffer the same consequences. There's things that we can do. And sometimes in cyber, it's easy for us to get into all the cyber and the tech things. And a lot of times it confuses our leaders, it confuses our stakeholders. And so sometimes maybe we'll use a metaphor. So I'm based in Atlanta. So in Atlanta, one of many companies headquartered here is Delta Airlines. And Delta Airlines, when you get on a plane, whenever it's time to do that again, you see there's a pilot and co-pilot, maybe other people. They have all the tools, all the radar, all the equipment they need to successfully take us from, well, Atlanta to wherever we want to go. What if we use a similar metaphor of how can we make sure that the teams that we're privileged to lead in cybersecurity have all the equipment, have the visibility, the ability to communicate, be able to see there's a storm on the horizon, if you will, so that they can be prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to those particular incidents. What's the ways we could do that? Through breach simulations, simple tabletop exercises. I tell you, it's really easy. You just pick up the newspaper and say, ooh, there's a bad thing that happened to a company and an industry or a sector that I'm in. Perhaps we can take that, literally rip from the headlines, and spend an hour talking about what if that incident, what if that scenario were to plop in the middle of our organization? How would we respond so that, again, we can get wisdom as cheaply as we can versus the hard and difficult and sometimes very public way.
Russell, I love that metaphor. And you're right. With when you have something to compare or you have a reference, it makes that conversation easier. But one thing I got from your response is you have to be disciplined to recognize those problems and to bring them into your corporate discussion. Rhea, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, actually, thank you so much for having me today, Michael. And to build off of what Russell spoke to, I guess the first thing I would say is that a cyber defense strategy is not just part of an IT strategy, it is truly a key part of a business strategy and an enterprise risk strategy. So one of the things that we can learn from Colonial Pipeline, as well as other entities that have been breached, is when you really start to dig a little bit deeper, asking the questions about what's the investment, the long-term investment for cyber defense, whether it's updating your infrastructure, whether it's making sure that you understand your risk appetite and your risk tolerance if something were to happen. Was that actually discussed, validated, and put into play at the highest levels of the organization? And what we're often seeing, and Colonial Pipeline being one of those examples, is the answer to that is no. And building off of what Russell spoke to, having the ability to drive that, we can do that internally in each of our organizations. And for businesses that are actually starting to ask themselves, what could we do differently? The first thing I can speak to essentially is literally keeping it at the highest levels, making sure that you understand, more importantly, what is your risk tolerance if something, a major disruption to your business, what will you do to be able to rebound from that? How will you rebuild the trust with your partners? How will you rebuild the trust with your clients? How do you rebuild the trust with your employees? All of those things. So not only just focusing, and I will tell you, and most of the panelists know because I've worked with them in a variety of capacities, one of the reasons why I shifted from the resilience part of managing to cyber risk to the actual strategy part was literally because example after example, including Colonial Pipeline, which hit all of us from a personal level because of the ability to be able to get gas or the question of whether to be able to get gas in the US, really hit us personally. And so asking ourselves, really, where can we start, and making sure that we do that at the highest levels.
Rhea, that's it's interesting. What I got from that is it's not only important to do a risk simulation of the threat happening, it's also response simulation. What will you do if this does happen beyond just IT, but everything around you, including those that may be in peripheral, like partners and suppliers and et cetera, et cetera. Fantastic, Rhea. Thank you. Russell, thank you for that. Right. So our next question,
Michael,
please, you have a follow-up. Absolutely.
Yeah,
please.
if I could jump in there just a little bit, kind of building on what Russell and Rhea said, which were just fantastic points, learned from the front line. I would follow up and build on it a little bit and say, hey, look at that incident response plan. I think every enterprise needs to have an incident response plan. And that incident response plan, like Ria said, needs to be really driven at the highest level. So it's not an IT response plan. It's not how are we just going to get our systems back up. It is, as Ria said it and Russell said, it's a communications plan. It's how are we going to get that trust back plan? And all of that is baked into that incident response plan. And if you have one, if you practice it, and if it is driven at the highest levels and across the enterprise, that is going to guide you a lot in that strategy on the front end, becoming, more resilient. But then on the back end, should something unfortunate happen, which odds are it will, you'll know what you need to do, and you'll know who needs to do it, so that you're not trying to figure out how you're responding, when you get shot at, when the bullets actually start flying.
Yeah,
And
Roy, I'm going to have a follow-up
add to
question. Oh, go ahead, David. Go ahead.
I will
Yeah, absolutely.
I will add to it because I think it's a very important point. I mean, responding and having a plan for responding and communicating is very important. But at the end of the day, I think that we're at a point where we all understand that prevention is very difficult at this point. And so mitigation is something that we definitely need to take into consideration, right? I mean, responding to an event is awesome, right? I mean, you don't want to be there, right? But when you respond, you want to make sure that the damage that you have and that you need to respond to is significantly lower than what it could have been. So mitigation, to me, is one of the most important things that companies should be doing nowadays. And so mitigation could be things like making sure that the Holy Grail is stashed in a place where the bad guys will not be able to find, right? I mean, even if they're on the system. Maybe you can do something to nudge the hackers or the bad guys away from the network. Mitigation is where we should spend most of our resources, I think, at this point, simply because if you think about it, many companies are necessarily standing against low-level criminals. I mean, if you think about it, if you think about the state actors we have out there, if they want in your system, they're in. Right? I mean, think about the Russian, the Chinese, the North Korean. If they want to be in your system, they're in, right? I mean, the only thing that you can do is potentially mitigate. And I think this is something that folks in governmental agencies and companies all over should pay more and more attention to.
Yeah, David and Roy, thank you for the follow-ups. I was going to, and either of you, please, or any of our panelists can answer this. So mid-size and small organizations, especially smaller, right? Smaller $100 million organization, not a $100 billion organization that doesn't have the templates, or even where do you start with a mitigation plan? What is that language? How do they find that, Roy? You brought it up, so I'll ask you. You said, you should have some plan in place. Everyone should be on the same page. Where do you get that alignment? Who starts that alignment? If you're a smaller organization that, yeah.
Yeah, you should call Roy. My number is blah, blah, blah. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. There's, if you didn't have somewhere to start, NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, has some really good templates that are, that you can use as a foundation for starting that mitigation and that risk management plan with respect to cybersecurity and IT. While not, kind of, because everything's going to have to be tailored for your particular situation. As David said, one of the things that you have to understand is what do you have and what do you need to protect. You don't need to protect everything the same, but the crown jewels, you need to put a little bit more around. But, so you need to tailor what you have, but NIST is going to be a really good place to start. And so once you do that, DFARS, depending upon what industry you're in, has some good stuff too. And those are the places that I would start. I would resist the temptation to Google on the internet and try to find a plan there, because again, you're going to want to tailor it to your specific circumstances and your specific situation. But that would be a really good, solid place to start, in my opinion.
Roy, thank you for that. Any follow-ups? Good. All right.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead, David.
This is not a shy group.
No, I love it. I love it. Listen, and our audience will love this also. So please, we do have the time. Let's, if you've got something, I'd love to bring it out. Absolutely.
David, you first. I'll go next.
So thank you, Ria. So in the context of mitigation, I mean, in the context of prevention, let's start there. I mean, we know that there are so many companies out there, right, who offers all kind of tools, all kind of technologies, all kind of policies that are supposedly, good, right, for prevention. In the context of mitigation, and to me, the major challenge is to really try and figure out what works and what doesn't. And this is what the evidence-based cybersecurity research group does, right? We, at the end of the day, trying to understand which tools, which policies really work and which doesn't. In the context of mitigation, we have less of it, unfortunately, right? Because the common notion, right, in the past and over the last 30 years or so was that we need to prevent. So we need to design tools that will allow us to prevent malicious activities from happening. We don't have too much going on, right, with respect to mitigation. Yes, you do have several companies working on deception. Cyber deception, I think, is one of the things that folks should consider in the context of mitigation. That's a great start. But in terms of effectiveness of those tools, I mean, unfortunately, we simply don't have too much data, too much research that tell us whether those mitigation tools are effective or not. So the bottom line is there are some companies over there who do offer mitigations, but unfortunately, we don't really know whether their products are good enough for what you're paying.
David, thank you very much. And just we have a slight delay in between our conversation, so hopefully I'm on time with what we're discussing here, because I had a little bit of a blip for a second. Ria, if I remember a moment ago, you said you wanted to follow up. I'll take one more and then we'll go to the next question.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I just want to speak to the fact that you mentioned small and medium-sized businesses. And you gave a number about of 100 million, maybe a little bit higher. But the reality is whether, no matter where we are, small businesses are truly the cornerstone of our economic resilience. And so, and that is global. So recognizing that many small businesses don't have the financial resources, maybe don't even have the technical resources, the capabilities to even understand where to start. So I just wanted to reinforce what Roy alluded to, and then followed up with some of the things that David spoke to from a university perspective. And when I say a university perspective, the evidence-based research group does a lot of work around mitigation to support small businesses, large businesses, and government agencies. But there are other resources available. And so what many people may not be aware, especially small business owners, is that there are multiple agencies where you can pull down free resources, or maybe have a partner with a business, a small business that can help you do that. And the first step is to truly understand your risk appetite. Do you even understand your risk posture so that you can implement mitigation strategies? And so I just wanted to reinforce that in the US, particularly the Small Business Administration, NIST was spoken to, Department of Homeland Security, but globally there are free resources for small businesses to tap into, so that at least they have questionnaires to answer questions on where they need to start.
Correct.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you.
And Michael,
that. Right.
I know I'm stepping out of turn, but I forget if I don't say it. Kind of following up on what Ria said, here in the U.S., CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, has tremendous resources. They will do assessments for your small business. So they have, that's a really good place to start also. If you don't, kind of get your hands around NIST.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Roy, for that follow-up. And Ria, good point. What is it, 80 or 85% of our, national economy is driven by the small business. So I think you made a spot on point. Maybe it's even higher. All right. So our second point, good segue. As a cybersecurity consultant services provider ourselves here with Intellius, we also see a growing interest for cybersecurity patrolling monitoring services that are related with things like banks and insurance companies, financial institutions. I'd love to know, and Roy, I'll come to you first, and then David, what are your observations regarding this? I would say it's not a new demand, it's an increasing demand. And how is legislation being adopted to respond to this growth of cybercrime? So specifically to cybersecurity patrolling and monitoring services for those, those cyber-prone industries, and how is legislation changing to support them?
Right. That's a fantastic question. And, I don't know that legislation is changing necessarily to support them as much as it is changing to make sure that those industries are aware of their risk and are reporting that risk. So after the Colonial Pipeline incident, for example, now, the whole pipeline and that infrastructure has risen on the kind of the scale of national importance. So now you're starting to see reporting requirements around incidents, cyber incidents for pipelines and energy infrastructure. You've always had it for banks. Banks have always been very good on cyber and spending the money, but now you're starting to see it in other industries. The Securities and Exchange Commission here in the U.S., for example, in last year or the year before, started requiring publicly traded companies to report publicly cyber incidents that they may have, or also, to the SEC at least, report cyber vulnerabilities. And so the kind of legislative infrastructure is changing to really make sure that companies are reporting these things, are aware of these things, are investigating these things. And that's not going to change. You're going to start seeing individual states come up with legislation. You're going to see more industries. I would not be surprised if the supply chain industry all of a sudden kind of got into the spotlight because of the supply chain difficulties that we've had. Now, some of those have been COVID related and other issues, but I would not be surprised if you started to see an increased emphasis coming from Homeland Security, at least in the US, around the supply chain and making sure that it becomes more resilient and, to David's point, better able to mitigate should something happen. So that's not going to change. You're going to see more, and it's going to be incumbent upon businesses, especially small businesses, to really understand what those legislative impacts and requirements are going to be on their businesses going forward, because they could be significant.
And before I go to David for a follow-up, I'll just say, think about energy industry. Think about the dawn of autonomous vehicles in the automotive industry. I can see lots of these of where this is going to apply. We focus a lot of our technology strength, especially in automotive, drone technology, autonomous vehicles. And I'm always thinking, what happens when everyone's on the grid? What does that cyber threat look like at some point? For another discussion, but you absolutely bring a good point out, Roy. Don't look at just financial and banking, et cetera. It's much broader than that. David, quick follow-up, and then we'll go to our next question.
Sure. So I'm not going to talk about the legislative angle, because I think Roy is way more equipped than I am to talk about it. I can talk about the demand for cybersecurity patrolling and monitoring, because that's one of the things that we do a lot. But in this sense, I'm going to wear my professor hat for just a second, right? I mean, there's a huge difference between monitoring and trying to find intelligence that is relevant to malicious software, hacker groups who are out there and trying to get your organizations, hackers group who are contemplating to take over the organization, right? And so, trying to collect and monitor platforms in order to get this information and then help your team to assess the risk and potentially prevent, more realistically, hopefully mitigate the threat that these guys generate. But, there's also this aspect of monitoring, information that is related to your company and that is being offered for sale on all those platforms that we oversee. May it be your company information, your employees, your customers' identities, all that is being offered for sale on many platforms, and we find that there's a lot of demand from financial institutions, from insurance companies, from all over actually for intelligence around identities, intelligence about bank accounts which are being taken over, and we see that happening more and more. As well as information about social security numbers and identities of American citizens. And one of the things that we see on our end is definitely an increase in the appetite of actors on underground markets to have this kind of information. In fact, earlier this morning, I just got a note from one of my students who sit on several Russian markets, underground markets, I should maybe emphasize, on which the student found that there's a lot of tutorials, a lot of people who are selling identities of companies, which then are being used to apply for SBA loans. And my students and essentially what we do is we engage, we try to figure out exactly what is the modus operandi, right, of this type of schemes and other, and it looks like at least in the context of the specific vendors we're communicating with right now, the vendor submitted an SBA loan on behalf of an American company, and he gets the payment directly to his bank accounts in Russia. So things like that, right? That we see the demand from many companies, many financial institutions here in the United States, as well as governmental agencies, for more intelligence in order for them to respond and mitigate some of those, malicious activities against them.
Yeah, David, thank you for that. So monitoring is key, not only technologically, but also in your case, physicality, having someone boots on the ground, listening inside of that dark web. That's an interesting sort of tactic to try to thwart these. So what happens, just curious, when you, and I don't know how much you can get into the detail, but very briefly, what happens when you find out this problem? Who do you report that to? I mean,
so we work with FBI. Yeah, we work with all the governmental agencies that are that are relevant. We actually tip Department of Homeland Security. We tip FBI. We work with here in Georgia Bureau of Investigation. All the relevant authorities, of course, the banks as well. I mean, we have a strong relationship with financial institutions, and whatever we find that is relevant for them, we send, and then they're able to prevent and mitigate.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Russell, this one's coming to you. We talked a lot about strategy. Now we got a little bit into some of the tactics here, what David was mentioning. But what are some of the sort of practical recommendations for the chief security officers, and specifically when we consider these, again, small and mid-size range of organizations that don't have the funding and the discipline? What should they do to make sure that their data is protected? What are some of those practical, maybe tactical things that they can do in that strategy?
To quote John Maxwell's book, good leaders ask great questions. That's what we get to do as cybersecurity leaders, no matter what size company is, be able to ask really good questions. Here's a great question I think applies here, applies in a lot of places. I came up with this recently, this idea of this question of how long can you stand to not know? How long can you stand to not know? So in this case, how long can you stand to not know your data is out on the dark web, like what David just mentioned, or whatever it might be? Well, we can ask that question. And the people we ask that question to, it's not us, it's not me, it's not our security teams, it's our business leaders, it's our executives, it's our board, it's our governance apparatus in our organization. And they can answer that question, they can understand that question without having to have a cybersecurity degree or certification or be a student of David or whatever that might be. And when they answer that, they can say, well, how long can I stand? Is it an hour? Is it a day? Is it a week? And they'll help to tailor that to get to the points that Rio was making earlier. But what's that overall risk appetite? How much of that risk, how much of that exposure can we stand? And then based on those answers, then we can, as cybersecurity leaders, it's easy when we know the answers to those questions. We know the answers to those questions, and we can go in and understand that. Understand where is our critical data at? Is it in our data center? Is it in somebody else's data center? Is it on my laptop? Is it on your cell phone? Where is it at? And then make really good decisions that say, well, do we need to, because of the criticality of the mission of our organization, do we need to perhaps increase the level? Ooh, we need enhanced monitoring, enhanced reporting, enhanced alerting for our critical data because, well, it's critical and our organization depends on it. And the mission of our company says that this data is necessary to perform and provide the services that comes from that. But again, asking those really good questions. How long can you stand to not know? And then fill in the blank. And in this case, for our data, then we can engage the business areas. They can start to speak. We can start to speak their language. They can start to understand us and leverage us as tools to protect and defend the organization properly.
Russell, thank you for that. Roy, just a quick follow-up from a legal perspective. What are some of the what kind of questions you would ask yourself as a chief executive officer, small, mid-sized organization that's inside of a room with CISO and CIO? What kind of questions is that CEO asking that have legal implications that they need to address?
Right. So from a legal implication standpoint, again, you're going to look at the industry and really understand the industry, understand your data. It all starts with the data. What is it? Where is it? How do we, defend it? What industry are we in? Are we now critical infrastructure, energy that now we have to comply with these new governmental initiatives? And so that's really the first question I'll ask. And that's a big question, a multidimensional question is we just need to understand the data. Kind of going a little bit astray of your question, though, one thing that I do always emphasize with, leaders when we start having conversations around cyber and compliance and governance and those sorts of things is that we can put in place all the technological solutions, and I always remind people, don't get too wound up on the technology solutions because at the end of the day, you've got humans and they still are statistically your greatest threat vector. And so, one of the things I always ask is, what is your training regimen? How are you, training your people, not only the IT people, but everybody in your organization, HR, communication, research, engineers, everybody, call center, because they are all threat vectors. And so I just always make sure that leaders are looking at things holistically, legal obviously being a big part of that, but looking at things holistically because it's going to be a holistic answer to the questions, with respect to cybersecurity, with respect to response, recovery, mitigation, all of those sorts of things. We have to think of them holistically. So I'm always asking holistic questions to get to help enterprises get to the right answers for their, for their business.
Roy, thank you for that. And it kind of goes into a segue for me. Rhea, I'd like to come
Michael,
to you on this. Yeah, go ahead, Rhea.
I would like to just quickly add to what both Roy and Russell spoke to. I think two common themes came through from what they spoke to. Number one, asking good questions and not making assumptions, right? And then the other part of that is it's a holistic approach. It's a holistic approach to devising a cybersecurity and data privacy strategy. And it is holistic in making sure that you have the right people as you're devising what that looks like. Make no mistake about it, legal is your friend. Okay, so many entities, when they hear from the lawyers and everything else, they get a little concerned, but your internal counsel or your partners, inclusive of legal, procurement, security executives, as well as business executives, are truly a foundation to asking these types of questions. Most businesses are moving towards storing their data in the cloud or are partnering with service providers to do so. They're in the middle of migrating to a hybrid environment and trying to evaluate what that looks like for their organization. And so the way that we did business before and the last 18 months should reinforce that for many of us, 20 months, I guess I should say. that we need to be asking the better questions around, where are you storing my data? How are you protecting it from a physical perspective, from a virtual perspective? What obligations do you have to me as your customer to be able to protect my data if for some reason you were breached? As business areas, before we even sign a contract, we should look very diligently at the terms and conditions of the data provider that is providing support to us. Making sure that if something were to happen, who owns that data? How do we get access to that data? All those types of things. These are things that are completely changing the landscape for how we are protecting our businesses from a cybersecurity and privacy perspective. And so I felt like I would be remiss if I didn't speak to that. So thank you.
This point actually was part of our follow-up question was, what kind of questions should you ask? And I love it because Russell was going from, what is the impact question at the very high level? What is it? What is life without or with? And then Roy brings us through this sort of analog of, you have to kind of know where your industry is, what are the nuances, and et cetera. And then Ria, you bring it down, you zoom in a little bit further to, here are the specific questions. Where and how is my data handled as a metaphor? There's a lot of those questions that I think are going to be key. And what I would ask is, if you had to find a lot of times these organizations don't know how to begin. They may have a CISO inside or they haven't hired one yet. How do you select a third party to help? So Russell has this within his organization. Some of the other folks on our panel as well. What are some of the questions you might ask a provider that's not providing data? They're not even managing data. What they're doing is helping you detect and monitor these intrusions. What would you ask that third party cybersecurity vulnerability partner to make sure you're selecting the right provider?
So I'll come at it. You didn't ask me, Michael.
That's
but
okay, Roy. Absolutely. Go ahead.
I'll jump in there. What I always recommend is that, if you don't know, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And so, it's difficult to ask the questions of a third party provider to see if they're doing the right thing or saying the right answers if you don't know to begin with. So what I often recommend is that CISOs or the IT leaders or the business leaders, they query your peers, join industry groups, query your peers. I do a lot of work with municipalities. And so what I'll tell municipalities is sometimes ask other municipalities that have used third-party providers. Have they been successful? Have they been good? Have they been responsive? Have they been able to help mitigate those threats? Have they been able to respond? Because that's going to be a good first step for you to understand, kind of, again, industry specific, what should you be asking? Because if you don't know what you should be asking, it's very difficult to ask those questions that you're alluding to. And so that's always the first step for me. Now, if you come to me or anybody on this panel that has been through the ringer on these sorts of things, of course, we can take you and recommend, providers that we know will do a good job for you. But if you don't know somebody like us, ask your peers. And I think that's a very good first step to getting to the right questions, even to ask of the providers and what those answers might look like.
Roy, thank you for that. And I'm watching David's face. It looks like David is getting excited to say, I want to give him a chance to respond.
So one thing that as a scientist, right, as someone who's doing this for the last 10 years and question all those companies, right, on a daily basis, what is good? I mean, what is your definition of a good vendor, right? I mean, unfortunately, in the context of the ecosystem we work with, we are talking about a cheap vendor, right? Because at the end of the day, the cybersecurity market is still a market for lemons, right? A market in which the vendor know more about the efficiency of his or her product than the customer, right? And in this kind of a ecosystem, in this kind of a climate, the customer is not willing to pay a lot of money, right, on something that he's not really sure what he's getting. And so, I can talk about the solutions, right, for this kind of ecosystem, but, the solutions that I believe is the most appropriate one is make sure that we have more evidence with respect to the effectiveness of those policies, tools, as well as vendors, right, in giving you the right product for what you're paying them. Right, and unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of research out there. I mean, we're trying to produce this kind of research in order to really allow you with this table that will allow you to tell, okay, this vendor is better doing this than that vendor because this vendor was actually able to detect this or detect that, right? But unfortunately, I think that there's no easy answer for your question. It's a very complicated one, but still, having said that, in the ecosystem and the climate that we work in, I think the answer is the cheapest vendor is usually what people will opt to go with.
And I'm seeing a similar trend, David. I was part of a RFP process where they were looking for the cheapest. They were actually using price to determine quality rather than quality and speed, because speed often is, as long as you can get both speed and quality, because of the threat is imminent, you want to get through as quick as possible. But they were leading with price, and I was surprised because this was an organization that is in a one of the I have to be careful with it, but there's in an industry that's very vulnerable, and I was thinking we shouldn't lead with price, we should lead with quality. But David, go ahead.
So again, and the folks are going with the price and not the quality because they have no information about the quality. Had you proven that more expensive prices for high quality product, I'm pretty sure that many of the customers would have opted the more expensive option. But in the absence of information with respect to the quality of the product, think about it. You go and you have two used cars that you're debating with, right? I mean, they're the same car. One costs $2,000, the other $1,500. Are you going to go with the $2,000 or the $1,500 in the absence of information? Most of us, and this is a solution that we, that we have people actually getting a Nobel Prize for it. Most of us will opt the $1,500 price, a commodity. So that's essentially what we see in the ecosystem.
Right, and kind of following up on my earlier point, I think, and I absolutely agree with David. There's nothing out there that there's no consumer reports for cybersecurity tools and things like that. So, there are organizations out there like the NTSC, the National Threat Security Coalition. I should know the exact name for it, but it's sponsored by the Technology Association of Georgia here in the Metro Atlanta area. That is CISOs. It's a CISO organization, and those kind of platforms allow you to have those informal, off the books conversations with your peers around what works, what doesn't work. We implemented this solution, it did not work. And so you have to lean on those sorts of things in the absence of that evidence and that the information that David is talking about, to really understand what is out there, what solutions will work better for your particular industry or your business, and what potentially doesn't work. Because one of the things I always tell people is nobody has a blank checkbook. And a lot of times we, base things on price because we don't have that blank checkbook. And what we need to be thinking about is prioritizing the risk and looking at the risk and then saying, okay, where can we get the most bang for the buck in terms of our security spend? And then start to ask the questions of what tools or techniques or training, I'll go back to training, will give us the most bang for the buck in terms of that holistic security profile that we're trying to achieve.
Roy, thank you for that. And we are almost out of time. So thank you for the expounding on that point. It goes back to what you said earlier, ask those right questions and turn to your community. So what Russell said earlier, go where the information's free. It's free for a reason. There's a community that cares about this and they share these same experiences. So let's go to one of the questions actually came in from LinkedIn. So Ria, I'm going to ask you this question, and feel free anyone to jump in. Are collaboration platforms like Slack, Teams, etc., a risky place for insider threats and other potential data leaks? And if so, what is being done from a cybersecurity standpoint. I guarantee all of us on this call have this somewhere in our organizations when you're talking about these communication and collaboration tools that can essentially have someone join groups and listen in physical or even in digital. So Ria. It looks like Ria might be frozen. Who wants to take
Might
that?
be
How about
frozen.
Russell?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, looking at the agreements, I mean, what types of the questions that we ask with respect to that? You know, what's the risk of a vendor who provides that service, them snooping on or being improperly configured and someone be able to take that away? Perhaps the same questions that you asked when you were looking to make an agreement, say, to use Office 365 or Google Documents. That same type of question. Okay, well, what can we gain if we do that ourselves? What can we gain when we go and partner with an organization such as Slack, or I see a lot of folks using Discord and other tools like that to say, what can I gain from that? What are the risks? What type of visibility do we have? How good of a steward of my data in their environment are they? What type of logging's in place? What type of responses in place? Again, taking the questions that we ask and really looking towards that stewardship of how well can they protect our data. And what I think is fascinating is sometimes, not always, but sometimes they actually do a better job than we do. And maybe it makes that decision a little bit easier when that happens.
Russell,
Right.
thank you for that.
I would,
Ria,
yeah,
I think Ria's
and
back.
I would
Just wanted to
consider
let everyone know
Michael.
Ria's back.
Oh, Ria's back. Okay, I'm not. Did you hear the question, Ria?
I did not.
No. Okay. All right. I'll let Michael repeat the question then.
Yeah, it was a real brief question about what can organizations consider when they're looking at collaboration tools like Teams, Slack, etc., where there's a threat always of an actor coming in via link or even using crawlers, right? So I think what Russell was saying is try to use an analog, like if you're going to purchase 365, Microsoft 365, what are the choices you might, when you're looking at privacy, when you're looking at the privacy policy, when you're looking at their measures to protect security, data, et cetera. So same thing for collaboration tools, which I think, if you think back, 15 years ago, macros in Microsoft Word were a big problem, right? But now we have that real person in call it trolling, if you will, joining these collaboration spaces. So maybe Ria, you could, that came from LinkedIn audience, by the way. What can we do, or how should we think about exposure when it comes to these collaboration tools like Teams and other forms?
That's a great question. I guess I'm going to speak to it in a couple of different ways. We've spoken a number of times of making sure that we're conducting our due diligence before we're introducing those into our infrastructure. And obviously, notable companies such as Microsoft and others have put a lot of investment in making sure that anything that's being introduced is done so in a protective manner, which of course, both teams, when I speak of both teams, a partner and a client, are actually working through what that actually looks like. But I'm actually going to take a different turn and speak to it from internally, because the reality is that potential exposure, as it relates to more than anything, it actually being introduced into your ecosystem, many times that first aspect of that is your employees. And so making sure that as you're introducing collaborative tools, that understanding what the governance structure is around using them, making sure that you're reinforcing your security awareness program and education about what that looks like, understanding what your DLP program looks like, data loss prevention program looks like, and what that means for how you might share information externally using collaborative tools. All of those things are things that I know organizations put in place to make sure that they mitigate any type of vulnerabilities when you're introducing collaborative tools into your infrastructure.
Ria, thank you for that. So any follow-ups? I know we're actually over time. For those on LinkedIn waiting patiently for us to wrap, I want to say thank you for your patience, but we have an awesome panel. I've learned a lot. Roy, if you have a quick follow-up to that, and we can wind down.
Yeah. Two quick follow-ups. One is, anytime you introduce a collaborative tool or any kind of tool into your environment, it's a risk. no matter what that tool is. So what I would say is think about limiting those introductions, because every time you introduce something, it's a risk. And there's always this, kind of thing to go with the latest and the greatest collaborative tool. Think about it before you do it. And then the second thing is, earlier you asked about the legal. I was remiss in not mentioning privacy. Privacy ties directly with cybersecurity in the sense of you're talking about data, you're talking about how to keep it secure, how to keep it private. They go hand in hand. And so from an industry standpoint, you need to be aware of privacy laws like Gramm-Leach-Bliley, like the California Consumer Privacy Act, like the laws in the European Union. All of those things you need to be thinking about with respect to your cybersecurity/privacy program holistically.
Roy, thank you. That was an excellent wrap up. That was one of the areas privacy policies are available and no one really reads them. They just don't know how their data is being used, and they're long and they're kind of, they're a bit elaborate. But I think it's really important for the strategist who's going to implement the security practices that you should be looking at the privacy policies of all of your partners and your partners and suppliers to make sure that you can see that trail all the way to the end. Rhea, Roy, David, and Russell, thank you so much for coming together with me today. We're excited that you joined. Thank you for your wisdom and your knowledge that you shared. I don't think we have other questions, but we have no more time, which is good, because that means that we covered a lot. I will have some follow-ups afterwards. Rhea, if someone wants to follow you on LinkedIn, how do they do that? Is it /Rhea Aiken?
That's correct. Well done. And
Good.
what we could do is share information on LinkedIn for others.
We will
as well. Mm-hmm.
Let's do that. I'll get everyone's handles and such, and we'll do a follow-up post so people can get in contact. Everyone on the call who's there still on LinkedIn, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your questions. We'll have follow-up. And to our panelists, have a wonderful rest of the week. And thank you again, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks.
Bye.